As the 1980s came to a close, creationists had been very successful at challenging evolution in schools using something called creation science. Creation science, despite the name, was essentially just religion dressed in a lab coat. It was not actually science, but it gave people leeway to challenge the teaching of evolution in schools. This, the Supreme Court decided, was a problem because, again, it was just religion in a lab coat. The Supreme Court banned the teaching of creation science in schools. Of course, creationists don't give up that easy. Some leading creation scientists at the time were working on a book called Of Pandas and People. After the Supreme Court decision, they decided to change every instance in the book of creation science and creation scientists with intelligent design and intelligent design proponents. This, thankfully, left a pretty good paper trail, including some nasty typos like "Cudesign proponentsists" they left in the book somehow and never noticed. And some years later, about 15 years later, some Pennsylvania parents found that their children were being taught creationism in school under the guise of intelligent design. None too happy, they sued. The case went to a federal court, and a justice actually put in by George W. Bush, who once more decided creationism, now under the guise of intelligent design, could not be taught in schools. But you can't keep a good Christian down, and these good Christians decided to take their case somewhere else, namely the internet. They created a litany of intelligent design websites promoting their cause, and even created some other websites like evolutionnews.com, which takes all the latest progress in evolution and evolutionary science and just tears it apart with poorly formed arguments and non-data. These people are not scientists. They are religious apologists. That's what they do. They're not very good at the sciences in question, even when they claim to be experts. Some of them have actually done actual science. Some of them do indeed have scientific training, which they completely disregard in favor of these very religious ideas. There are some amazing YouTubers who have done some amazing work at debunking these ideas. Professor Dave is probably the best. He has done a number of direct responses to them, which I would encourage you to go check out. But now that we have some history on intelligent design creationism, let's talk about the clip we are going to watch today. You see, one of these intelligent design creationists appeared on Joe Rogan somewhat recently. Joe Rogan, of course, is not convinced by creationism and does think evolution is real, because it is. So, of course, he was very skeptical of the claims being made, and actually it turned out to be a pretty good video. So we're going to watch a short clip of Joe Rogan talking to an intelligent design creationist and see where this conversation goes. I will be adding commentary, of course, but I must point out that the intelligent design creationist lies for a living. It is what he does. He is a liar. He constantly misstates things. He constantly uses scientists' words in ways they did not mean. And you can't believe anything this guy says. Go watch the Professor Dave videos and you will understand exactly why. So let's watch the clip. Let's see what they have to say.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in, I believe in microevolution. I believe that there...
Okay, we got to stop it here just for a second, because creationists do this thing where they'll say they believe in microevolution, which is essentially evolutionary changes on a very small scale. Think viruses evolving, for example, smaller traits evolving, like artificial selection in different dogs, making different dog breeds. That sort of thing is microevolution. It turns out, if you have enough changes over a long enough period of time, you get macroevolution, which is a change between species. You get speciation events. But of course, people like this do not accept that species evolve in major ways, so they cannot admit that and just claim microevolution as if there is some distinction, but really the only distinction is the amount of time involved.
Real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor.
Well, you shouldn't be, and here's why. DNA shows the genetic linkages of all forms of life. If all forms of life didn't descend from one common ancestor, they should not be so strongly linked through DNA. If we had come from multiple different ancestors, if different forms of life on Earth had, you would expect them to have very different DNA profiles, if they even had the same sort of DNA structure at all.
I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell.
Okay, he's already misstating things here. That is not an example of evolution, that is an example of abiogenesis. That is the formation of life, not evolutionary processes. I see why he wants to do this, because abiogenesis is a very hard subject to crack. Nature had billions of years to achieve abiogenesis. Humans in laboratory conditions have not had anywhere near that amount of time, so it is very hard to actually repeat that process, but we are making continual strides in that direction. But his rejection of it, and then claiming that it's an evolutionary process, casts doubt on the whole evolutionary process itself, which is why he does that.
And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today. I tended to.
His complaints are going to be very different than their complaints would be. In one of those Professor Dave videos I mentioned, he actually did contact a scientist quoted about this sort of thing and says that he is being misrepresented by people like this.
Conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society in London, Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks.
Let me tell you about what he contributed to the discussion. Nothing. There is a video of him at the discussion. He just sat there awkwardly and said nothing while they discussed among themselves because he has nothing to give them. He is not a part of this discussion. He does not have any novel ideas for them about evolutionary processes because he does not really believe evolution is a thing that actually occurs on wider scales. He was not at all suited to this discussion, and it showed.
And many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution. The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the five major, what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms. It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms. Think about, for example, Darwin's finch beaks.
Okay, so I need to point something out here. Again, he is misquoting what happened. He is misquoting the person. This is not the argument that was actually being made at this conference he's talking about. He does this a lot, so if he says anything that sounds remotely suspicious that I happen to miss, you might want to Google it because he is probably lying deliberately. He does not have anything to provide to this discussion. He is not searching for novel mechanisms for evolution. He is trying to say, if it doesn't work, if some aspect of evolution doesn't work, that must be because there is an intelligent designer, i.e. God, who did it instead. This is called the God of the gaps. Creationists are all about this. Anytime there's gaps in our knowledge, these kinds of people want to fill it with God. And intelligent design is one way they do that.
Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place. So
actually, it completely does. Again, if you have enough of these small-scale changes over a large enough period of time, you are going to end up with entirely new species. Dogs, domesticated dogs, are not the same species as wolves. There are significant differences between them, even though there is a fairly small genetic difference between them. Dogs and wolves don't have a whole lot in common anymore. And they are different species, but they are descended from the same species. In fact, obviously, dogs are descended from wolves themselves. This is just one example of speciation. Now, dogs have yet to become anything else because not enough time has passed. But you can imagine, look at, for example, a German Shepherd versus a Chihuahua. If you separated these species by enough time, enough space, if there was no interbreeding between them of any kind whatsoever, given long enough, they would definitely spin off into different species. They would both still be from the same family, but they would no longer be able to successfully breed. They would have differences that are so massive, it's essentially the difference between a dog and a wolf. And again, if given long enough, those changes will continue, and you will get entirely new forms of species descending from them. This is not a hard concept to grasp, but a lot of people don't grasp this concept so easily, which is where people like this come in and try to sow doubt. The seeds of doubt, I should say.
Modification, yes. Innovation, no.
But modification over massive amounts of time, don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because
Correct, that's how it works. Good job, Joe Rogan. He is not taking any nonsense here.
a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
Well, time,
primates.
Yeah, time was always the hero of the plot. But let me,
That's one of their stock lines. They like to downplay the effects of time, as if to say, if you have these changes over a massive period of time, you're still going to have the same animal. You're still going to have the same basic animal. But that's not correct. It's just not. And the way they try to downplay it is frankly silly.
let me just run a couple of arguments by you, and let's see what you think, okay? And I developed these in a lot of detail in my book, Darwin's Doubt. If we now know, thanks to the genetic revolution,
The genetic revolution, which, by the way, proves that evolution is real. Even if we didn't have DNA, which Darwin didn't have DNA at the time, even if we didn't have DNA evidence, we could still understand that evolution is a real thing that really happens. But having DNA and understanding it better and better actually just provides more and more evidence for the case of evolution.
the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have at least you have to have new code, because
Well, that's kind of incorrect. I mean, mutations work in a bunch of different ways. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not qualified to speak on this. Again, I would recommend the videos of Professor Dave for this specific subject. But he is acting as though to create a new species, you're doing it all at once. You're just randomly generating a whole bunch of new DNA. He's acting as though eventually a wolf is just randomly going to spawn an entirely new species with added information. That's not how it works. It is a series of small changes over time that result in the evolution of species. So no, that's not how it works, and he has to know that's how it works. These people have to know. They're not that ignorant.
all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need.
In the greater scheme of things, when you get down to like the basic level, there isn't really a fundamentally new type of animal, since essentially we are talking about small, tiny changes over millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years. You are not going to have a new animal just spring up from an old one. These changes take a whole lot of time. It's a very long process. There isn't really such an example of rapid evolution like in apes, for example. You just don't see that kind of thing. It takes a very long time for a reason.
New anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types.
This is another thing they do. They have this idea they call irreducible complexity, which is that if you take one part of any one thing and remove something, it becomes non-functional. They illustrated this with their example of the bacterial motor. I forget what it's called. It's a flagellum motor, essentially. Flagellar motor, something like that. This is a long time ago. I haven't read about this stuff in forever, honestly. I'd forgotten all about these people. But this motor works in a certain way, and their argument was that it had to come about in one piece, because if you remove any one piece, then essentially the system doesn't work anymore. It doesn't have a function. It can't operate. Scientists have showed that's not the case. They have showed how there is a ramping up and how its usefulness changes over time. They have showed the process by which these bacterial motors have evolved. And this is not the only case. There's other cases like this. The eye is another good example. A lot of these, not these people in specific, I don't think, but maybe they are. A lot of people will point to the eye as an example of something that if you remove certain features, it becomes less useful. But if you read books like, for example, Richard Dawkins, his greatest show on earth, The Evidence for Evolution, he charts out a clear path for the evolution of eyes, from their most simple form to their most complex forms today, in a way that's very easy to understand. So these people want to argue there's an irreducible complexity to things like bacterial motors or eyes, and they just can't make that argument because we now know how these things came about over long periods of time.
New types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food.
These things did not pop up suddenly or spontaneously. These things evolved over large periods of time. I don't know why he's so interested in sticking on this particular point, because it makes him look silly if you know anything about the evolutionary process. Again, I am not a scientist. I am not an expert. I am a very casual consumer of materials on evolution and science, and yet this is all pretty basic stuff to me, so I imagine he must know.
So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get a new, it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. So we have these long digital bit strings of A's, C's, G's, and T's, not zeros and ones, but A's, C's, G's, and T's in a digital string, and we call that a gene. And if you have a section of DNA for building a protein, that's great, all works. Now, but if you want to build a fundamentally new form of life, you got to have new proteins to service the new cell types to build the new anatomical structures.
These things co-evolve. That's how it works. They evolve together. These things don't pop into existence one at a time. They co-evolve together. If they didn't, the species would not be fit to survive, and it would not survive. That's how natural selection works.
In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system.
Okay, he is wrong here. This is one thing I do have personal experience with. I am not an expert computer programmer. I haven't done it for a living, but I do know some programming. I have messed around with it sometimes. I enjoy it sometimes. I like making little programs here and there. I made my own little chess program just to have fun with, stuff like that. I mean, I've even designed little Pokemon games just to play around with myself, just sort of taking sprites and stuff from Pokemon games, putting them in and making them work like they should. It's a long process. It's very difficult sometimes, and it's a lot. But I will tell you this much. There have been so many times when I was doing these little programming things where I made a change I didn't even realize I had actually made, and for some reason, something that wasn't working started working. Or, alternatively, even crazier, something I didn't intend to happen happened, and it was a good thing. Now, if you have done computer programming at all, you will have this same experience where you will be making changes and something works, and you don't know what you did to make it work. You'll have to go through that code and change things again and keep changing them to try to find out what you did that makes something work. There's also some really amazing examples of this. There was a speed run of one particular game where a cosmic ray hit the computer chip, changed one of the digits, and actually helped get the speedrunning record. This is a thing that actually happened. That is a random change caused by a ray from across space that did something positive. And in fact, that actually has a very interesting analog in evolutionary science, because one of the hypotheses for why the human brain suddenly got so much bigger, I say suddenly, but it was a slower process, is because of a cosmic ray causing a gene mutation that increased the size of the brain in humans, or the density of the brain in humans. That's one possible reason. We can't say for sure, but it's possible, if not plausible. I mean, if it can happen for a video game, why can't it happen for the brain? But that's just one idea. That's not necessarily the case. It's just a very good idea for what happened. So he is wrong here. And if you have expertise, or even not, if you have a hobby in programming, you can see that pretty clearly. He's wrong.
The functional sequences they're highly isolated in what's called sequence space. You can change a few things and still retain function. But after a very few number of changes, you're going to degrade the function, and long before you come up with a new function. Now, the Darwinian mechanism...
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, yeah, when you change a lot of stuff in computer programming, you end up with a lot of bugs and a lot of errors and that sort of thing, and then you have to fix all of those problems. But in nature, we actually do have systems for fixing that kind of thing. It's natural selection. If there are changes that are made, let's say there's a good change and 10 corresponding bad changes, that the species with that change, if those genes spread, is likely to not make it. Now, that's just sort of like a very hyperbolic way of putting that. It's not technically accurate, but those genes are not likely to survive against more fit competing genes. So if those genes percolate through like one specific family, that family is going to be less likely to make it than, let's say, a family that has one good gene and maybe like half as many bad genes. Now, that's not how the process really works. That's just an example I'm using to explain the idea that natural selection works in much the same way as a computer programmer would with dealing with bugs and things of that sort.
Starts with the idea that there are random changes in those digital bit strings, those sequences of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And based on our experience in the computer world, we would expect that random changes are going to, again, degrade those strings long before they're capable of building a new protein.
Well, I sort of take issue here with what he's calling random. To the extent that these changes happen, I guess you could call them random in some regards. Genetic mutations are going to be a sort of random thing, but the outcome of those changes is not going to be randomness. Those changes, I mean, a lot of them aren't going to do anything. But the ones that do things can do something bad or something good. They can do something that helps or something that hurts. And if you end up with more that hurt than help, you're going to have a problem for the survivability of that family, that particular branch of that species. Natural selection, literally selects for this exact thing he's saying it does not.
And there's now very compelling experimental evidence that that's true. There's an Israeli molecular biologist, Dan Tofik. Unfortunately, he died fairly recently in a tragic accident. But he was doing mutagenesis experiments on sequences of code for building specific proteins that fold it into stable structures. They're actually called protein folds. And he found that between 3 and 15 mutations was enough to degrade the thermodynamic stability of the protein structure that the gene was making. And once you lose that thermodynamic stability, you have no functional possibilities.
Is there?
Now, again, I want to say, I don't know if he's describing this properly. This specific example I have not heard of. I have heard of other ones he's mentioned, but this one I have not really heard of. But at the same time, I think it is important to note that he very frequently misstates these things. So the results may have not been what he said they were, but even if they were exactly what he said they were, again, nature has systems for rooting out these things. If there are too many negative changes in DNA in the genes of a species, that species becomes less likely to survive. Survival of the fittest. That's how the process works. Nature selects against exactly this kind of thing. That's how it works.
Is there possibly an undiscovered mechanism for protecting against that we're not aware of yet?
Possibly.
I love Joe Rogan's question here. That was a really good question. Big shout out to Joe Rogan there. You really nailed this guy to the wall in this one. I wish I'd thought of that first, but nobody can think of everything. So thank you, Joe Rogan.
But there's numerous lines of evidence suggesting that that mutations are within limits. You can modify again. You can optimize an existing protein structure called a fold. But if you allow too many of those mutations, you're going to degrade. And long before you would get a fundamentally new protein structure, another protein fold. So that's just one of many. I want to run one.
He didn't really answer the question. I think Joe Rogan would make a lot better of a scientist than this guy if he's asking questions that good and that pointed. Essentially, Joe Rogan was pointing to the same thing that I did, but in a much better way, in the sense that it didn't take as many words to get out. But yeah, there is. Natural selection itself is a good mechanism for preventing these kinds of things. But I guess in a greater sense, there could be other protective mechanisms that we don't know about, or that he hasn't thought about or doesn't want to acknowledge. And that would actually be, I'm assuming people are researching that kind of thing anyway, but that would be a very interesting avenue for research. But of course, guys like this, they don't really do research like that. They're not trying to find ways to make evolutionary theory better. They're finding ways to try to tear it apart so their religion wins.
Another argument by you that I think is very intuitive. if you want to build, it turns out that there are structures or systems for building that are very important for building new animal body plans, and they're called developmental gene regulatory networks. They were discovered at Caltech by Eric Davidson and colleagues. Eric Davidson has also unfortunately recently passed away in the last few years. But what they discovered is that you not only have genes for building proteins, you have genes that are building for constructing molecules that send signals that tell the genome when to express other parts of itself. So you've got there's signaling molecules that are telling the genome when to turn this part or that part on in order to build the right proteins at the right time as new cells are going through cell division in the process of animal development. So if you go.
So what did they say about it? What was their solution for all of this? What would they want to say about how this works? Because I notice he's probably going to leave that out. He's going to say, well, this is a problem for this reason. But he's not going to say, like, what the researchers actually said about it, or even if it's a problem to begin with. I'm not sure if it's a problem he's describing, but if you want to get technical, he's not bringing up anything to support the idea of evolution. He's bringing up things against it. So he surely at least thinks that there is some major problem here with this information. But I suspect the people in question he's talking about would have some solutions in mind for him, which he could also have if he were an actual scientist and not a charlatan.
From 1 cell to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, et cetera. You've got to, and as you have a developing animal form, there are points in that trajectory where it's important to differentiate one type of cell from another, and for certain types of cells, muscle cells as opposed to nerve cells or bone cells, to start to be constructed. And all of this is closely choreographed by these signaling molecules. So you get DNA that builds regulatory RNA that turns on another part of the DNA that then turns on, that builds a protein for servicing a particular type of cell at the right time and not.
I don't think he got to his point there, but it's irrelevant because whatever his point was going to be, it's not a good one. He was probably saying something like, well, why are there all of these overarching features of all of this stuff if it evolved in a certain way? Now, I don't think that's really a terrible question to ask if that's indeed what he was going to ask, but I do think there are actual solutions to that kind of question. And again, he doesn't seem to want to actually think about the answers to these things. He's not the kind of guy to like try to solve these problems. He wants to point out problems, to poke holes in the idea of evolution because he is a religious person. He is essentially, like all of the intelligent design creationists, just doing this to promote religion. They don't care about the science, they don't care about evolution, they don't care about anything except proving their case. The case for evolution gets stronger as time goes on. It was immediately strong from the outset and just gets stronger and stronger all the time. Now, the mere fact that people are identifying problems with evolutionary mechanisms is not a bad thing, but he is trying to make it sound like it is. He's trying to make it seem like, well, there's so many holes in this theory, how can it possibly hold up? They need a new one. Well, you're not doing anything to help solve these problems. The scientists you're talking about are actually doing things to solve these problems. And I also think he overstates a lot of these problems personally. I think this because other people have gotten in contact with people he talks about, and they have said exactly that he is overstating his case for why these things are such big problems. In a sense, we're really talking about kind of small things. He's making molehills into mountains, or anthills into mountains for that matter. So keep that in mind when listening to people like that. Again, I would suggest those videos by Professor Dave. He is much more knowledgeable than I am on these things because he is educated directly in these subjects, whereas I am very much a pop consumer of this sort of thing. But hey, I responded the best I could. You got to give me credit for that. Well, my friends, this is indeed the end, and I thank you for watching. If you like this video, please leave a like. If you have something to say, positive or negative, please leave a comment. I'll probably respond to it. If you like this channel and like what I do and want to recommend more videos, please subscribe and do the aforementioned things. It'll help with the algorithms, and most importantly, have a great day.